Biba is a Bay Area-based freelance science journalist
New York
focusing,
City.
well, now New York City-based. She just moved back to the Northeast, so we'll have to give her a warm welcome back. Focusing on the intersection between science, technology, and popular culture. She's a correspondent for Wired magazine and the Science Correspondent for the Mythbusters Tested.com. Her work also regularly appears in Scientific American, Newsweek, Popular Science, and Popular Mechanics. Erin recently moved back to the Northeast, so let's give her a warm welcome back.
I interrupted you.
So to get started, science is such a targeted and specific, concentrated genre of journalism.
Yep.
What got you interested?
Well, I am a big nerd, and I always have been. I've always been really interested in science and technology and just all the geeky things you can think of. And I mean, I think the thing that really got me into science writing was that I started my career as an intern at Wired magazine in San Francisco, and Wired writes about science and technology. And you know, one of the things that I always thought about, you know, I always was interested in science. I always thought it would be interesting to write about it, but I always thought, well, you have to have a background in science. You have to have a science degree or, you know, have some sort of education in science to be able to write about it, right? Because as a science journalist, my job is to distill really complex scientific ideas into like really simple forms so that people who don't know or don't care about science can find it interesting and exciting and want to read about it. So I thought without that education, then there would be no way that I could write about science. But when I got to Wired, I realized that at Wired there are no beats. Everybody, for the most part, unless you work for the web. But in the magazine side of things, there are no beats, and everybody just kind of writes about what makes them excited and what they think is fun and what they think is interesting. And there were a lot of people there with no science background who were just writing about science because they loved it. And I had one editor in particular who was really science focused, and he and I would always talk about science, and he would say things like, well, why don't you write about that story? And so I just, you know, it lit a fire under me, and it made me realize I don't need that background. I can learn from the scientists, you know, that I'm interviewing, and learn from the people that I'm from my sources, and then use that. So I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but or ahead of you, but one of the things that I always talk about when I talk about science journalism and having a background is that I actually think it's a really big benefit to me that I don't know anything about science. Well, I do now because I've been doing it for years, but when I go into a story, I know what somebody who has no understanding of the topic needs to know in order to understand it. And so that when I sit down to write it, I can look back at, you know, the mindset that I had before learning about it, and sort of go back through that process of how I learned it, and then use that to explain it in the story. And you know, another thing that's really great to remember if you're interested in science and wanting to go into science is that scientists a lot of them are teachers. A lot of them are professors, a lot of them are working at universities, and it's their job to teach people how to better understand their work. And so, you know, when I go into a story about a topic that I don't know anything about, I go into it expecting the scientists to teach me, and I'm, you know, just not afraid to ask questions, say I don't understand that, explain that to me again, say that to me in a different way, and they appreciate that I want to understand it because they appreciate, you know, the dedication to factual accuracy. That happens. I think scientists can tend to be a little bit nervous about speaking to the media because, you know, they have a little bit of a mindset that if you simplify something, then you might be dumbing it down. So if you can explain to them that, you know, you're just trying to learn it and understand it so that you can explain it accurately and correctly without dumbing it down, then they appreciate that. And so that helps build a rapport with the source too.
So going back to your time at Wired, can you just kind of walk the students through kind of your journey? So just starting with undergrad, what you were interested in, back in the classes you took, and then your internship.
I will tell you my career path, but I will say, when I was in grad school, there was always that was like the number one question. How did you get to where you are today? And every single answer was different. So what I'll tell you, but take it with a grain of salt, because I think like the most important thing to remember if you're going into journalism is that there is no one career path, that you can get to where you want to be however you want to, and that, you know, hearing the way that somebody got there isn't necessarily going to help you. You're going to find your own path. So, okay, so that being said, so I went to SUNY Buffalo for my undergrad. You know, pretty basic state school, and there's no journalism program there. So, and I didn't even really know, I was an English major, I didn't even really know I wanted to be a journalist. I just knew I loved writing and I loved reading. So I just got involved in the school magazine and the school newspaper, and I just spent a lot of time sort of learning from the other students. And then by the time I was done, I realized, well, journalism is something I want to do. I have absolutely no education in it at all. I kind of taught myself everything, so I need to go to grad school. So I went, I got into Medill. Do you guys know Medill? It's the Northwestern School of Journalism. I'm completely brainwashed in saying this, but it's probably the best journalism grad school.
It's in Evanston, right outside of Chicago.
And that was an incredible experience. Medill is an amazing school. They really immerse you in journalism. They kind of throw you into it. You know, even in your first, you know, few months of being there, you are out on the street reporting, you are meeting people. They have a newsroom, they have a Chicago newsroom, they have a newsroom in Washington, D.C., they have an international program. So through Medill, I ended up going to D.C. and doing some Capitol Hill reporting for PC World. And then after that, I went through Medill to Sydney, where they sort of set me up with a residency at the Sydney Morning Herald, which is Australia's sort of New York Times version of the New York Times. And then while I was in Sydney, I applied for an internship at Wired. And then I got that, and I flew from Sydney to San Francisco. I moved straight to San Francisco. And then I did a 6-month internship at Wired, which was, I mean, incredible. Whatever you learn in school, it's not even, you know, a tenth of what it's like to actually be in a real newsroom at a real publication, working with real editors and
Lots
real
of
writers.
hands-on experience.
Yeah, no kidding. So, and that's when I really, you know, I always loved technology. I always loved, you know, all that geeky stuff. But that's when my love for science writing really blossomed. So then, when my internship was up, I didn't really want to leave. So I just sort of figured out a way to stay. There certainly weren't any jobs available, but they have a lot of freelance fact checkers at Wired, and so I just made friends with the fact checking, the research editor, and I got a job as a freelance fact checker, and I did that at Wired for about 5 years, I want to say. And you know, fact checking is one of these things that I think, I don't know how you guys talk, how you guys hear about fact checking or what people talk to you about fact checking, but when I was in grad school, fact checking was sort of like, nobody said nice things about it. It was sort of, people sort of considered fact checking to be not a real legitimate journalism job. But I have to tell you, if you want to learn the ins and outs of a publication, if you want to get to know the editors and you want those editors to respect you, then being a fact checker is one of the best things you can do, because you are first of all, you are re-reporting the stories, and at Wired, you're re-reporting the stories of some of the great writers. You are interviewing all of their sources, you are reading all of their notes, you're getting to know the writers really well, and the writers are getting to respect you because you are saving their asses. You are preventing them from being embarrassed on a national level for making a stupid mistake. And you get to know the story so well and so closely that you then become the editor's go-to person for a question. If an editor wants to, you know, elaborate on something, and if an editor wants to know more, if an editor wants to know why, they're going to come to you. They're not going to go to the writer, because they know that by the time you've dug into that story, you know more about the story than even the writer themselves. And so, you know, by the time, 5 years of fact-checking at Wired, every single editor in that office knew who I was, knew me really well, knew all of my strengths, knew the kinds of stories I was good at, the kinds of things that I was good at, and would just come up to me and say, hey, I've got this story, do you want to write this story? So, you know, a lot of people and a lot of my friends have broken into the business by being fact checkers, getting to know editors really well, and then doing writing on the side. And I think you'll find a lot of freelance fact checkers are also freelance writers. And it's a really great way to have kind of a steady job that you know is going to have money coming in while you're building your freelance base and while you're getting to know, you know, building clients and getting to know people. You have that guaranteed work of the fact checking. And it's a lot of work, it's really hard, it's not necessarily entirely rewarding. You don't always
It's not glamorous.
It's absolutely not glamorous.
You have to be the nitpicker.
You are absolutely the nitpicker, and you're like fact checkers are the kings of the hedge. You know, you're always hedging it. You're always saying, well, it's not every one of these things, but it's most of these things or a lot of these things, but how would you know if it's every one of these things? So, you know, but I really do think fact checkers are some of the hardest working, smartest people in the business. And to start off as a fact checker, you can build yourself a great reputation. If you're good at it, you can build yourself a really great reputation amongst, you know, the people that in the publication that you want to get to know.
The unfortunate part, though, is that fact checkers now are very unappreciated. Where, for example, when I started at People Magazine, there were 30 reporters who, also known as fact checkers. They just gave them the role of reporters. There are none now on staff.
Oh my God.
There are none.
That's terrible.
When I left, there were only 10, and now there are none. They hire them on a freelance basis, but probably maybe 5 to 7 right now.
Wow.
But there are none on staff right now. There's where budget cuts are coming in are in roles like
Well, and that is a terrible thing.
It is.
Because fact checkers, you know, prevent everyone in the whole publication from being
True.
embarrassed. And, you know, I can't even tell you how many errors I have caught in my years as a fact checker. And it made me a better reporter.
Yes.
Because I learned how other reporters worked. I learned how, you know, and also I have to say, you know, being a fact checker for some of these great writers made me and seeing their process and how they work and seeing the sources that they interview and how they do what they do, it made me realize that I could do it too. Because here I was, you know, just getting started, just fact checking and thinking, I could have done that. I could have written this story. And it gave me confidence to, you know, move forward in my career. So I did that for about 5 years. And then I had built up enough of a client base while I was fact checking and freelance writing at the same time that I could step away from the fact checking and still go full-time freelance and still make money, which, you know, is important.
That leads into my next question. How did you build yourself up as this expert, credible science journalism?
Well, I think Wired helped me. You know, when you have, it's, you know, it has a lot to do with your byline.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I started my career at Wired, and I had a Wired byline for my first 5 years of my career, and I was writing about science. So if you know, and if Wired trusts me and believes in me and thinks that I, you know, am a credible science journalist, then other people will too. So, I mean, that was really the best way to get started was I could, you know, once I had my Wired byline, I could go to other places and say, hey, I'm a Wired correspondent, I write about science for Wired, and I have this story idea that I think would work for you. And because I have that byline, then they would be able to trust me. And then I think, you know, the other thing is, I think when I was talking to some guys here earlier about, you know, building your brand and you know, as a freelancer, I am a little small business. I'm a small business owner, and that business is me. And you know, I have a brand, and my brand is Erin Biba, and through social media and, you know, other ways of, you know, getting my name out there, you know, people know my brand. People, you know, and it sounds kind of ridiculous to say that, but, you know, the more that your name is recognizable and the more that your name is associated with a certain kind of writing and you know, respectable, like you do good work and your stories are well respected, you don't make mistakes, you write interesting stories, you're reliable, you write for other publications and people feel like they can trust you, then the less you'll have to pitch, and the more you'll start just getting called to do stuff, and people will contact you to do stories. So building my brand has been a really important way for me to have my name known and to be, considered a more legitimate writer.
Can you elaborate on that more about building these relationships with the editors and really keeping in touch with them, having them call you pitching them? Because we're talking about pitching stories all throughout the course, and how, you pitch good stories, an editor sees that you turn in good work on time. They might give you a call back and might have stories for you. Yeah,
I think, the key, it's like any employer-employee relationship. Your editor, and it's, every editor-writer relationship is different. So I have different, individual, the way that I work with different editors individually is different. Depending on my editor, I will behave in a different way based on how I know that editor works and what that editor wants. But I think that the key is, not everybody is a great reporter. Not everybody, and I think if you're going to value one thing over the other, if you're going to value being a great writer and being a great reporter, I personally think it's much more important to be a great reporter, to be able to know the right questions to ask, to be able to, even if you don't get it into the story, when your editor comes back to you and says, hey, what about this? That you can come back to them right away and say, oh yeah, I asked about that, here you go. And the editor knows that you are smart enough to ask all the right questions, that your reporting is...
Interviewing skills.
That your reporting is deep enough, that you ask all the questions so that even if it doesn't get into the story, you understand the larger context of the story, which is really, really important. You don't ever want to write a story that you don't see the big picture. You have to be able to see the forest through the trees always. So I think if an editor can count on you to be a great reporter, then if your writing is not fantastic, which I think I have a lot to learn in terms of being a writer. I'm a great reporter. I have a ways to go. I've only been doing this 10 years. I still have a lot to learn in terms of being a good writer. But that's less important to my editors because they can work with that. They can finesse the language. They can, they can make changes to that, but they can't fix bad reporting. The last thing an editor wants to do is have to do reporting themselves or rely on a fact checker to do reporting. But if they know that, you might not have gotten everything into the story that they wanted, or that, as long as you have that information, you can provide it right away, and you can be available to them and, not be sensitive. I think that's another thing that's really important about an editor relationship, is not be sensitive about every single word. Let the editor do their job. Don't argue too much with them.
Don't take it personally.
Don't take it personally. This business is a lot about rejection. Just because somebody doesn't like your story doesn't mean they don't like you. I'm sure you've heard that before. And just be available, and I think that's really one of the most important things is when your editor has a question, answer it right away.
So that's cultivating and maintaining a relationship with editors across various magazines. How do you cultivate and maintain your sources, your medical sources in the field? How do you have like a running roster of people you go to?
I don't really, and I think that is maybe a little bit strange. I think a lot of writers do. I have a few people here and there, a few sources that I do go back to time and again. I would say a lot of the relationships I maintain via Twitter. There's one physicist that I'm really friendly with who I go back to a lot when I have questions about complicated physics, and he understands that I might not necessarily understand physics that well. And he's a good public communicator, so he's on Twitter, so I keep in touch with him that way a lot. I have other sources that I'll just go back to every now and again when I have a question, but for the most part, I think with science writing, and for me, I'm always interested in the next story and the thing that I haven't written about yet, so I don't necessarily always go back to the same sources again, because for me, I want to interview somebody I haven't interviewed before.
How do you find those new sources? Do you use social media? Do you kind of send out an email blast to your network?
It's a really tough question. I mean, I think that's the same question as how do you find a story? You know, reading a lot, you know, going to, you know, a lot. I know which universities are good at different things. You know, I know, you know, if I want to write about deep ocean exploration, well, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute is a world leader in deep ocean exploration, and I know their PR person. So I'll call her and I'll say, hey, I need this particular story about this kind of thing in deep ocean exploration. Who do you have there who can answer that question? And that's really sort of how I go about.
But at least knowing your territories.
Right. I mean, I know my territory. I know what, you know, what areas of science, you know, who studies what areas of science. But a lot of times, you know, I'll write about science, a topic of science that I don't know anything about. And then, you know, I do have to ask people. So one of the things I always do when I'm writing a story is, you know, when I get done with an interview, I'll say, who else should I be talking to about this? You know, scientists all know, they know everybody in their field, and they know everybody who's an expert in that. And so, you know, oftentimes I just ask my source. I'll say, you know, I'm just getting to know this topic. I'm just starting to dig into this. Who else should I be talking to? Who are the other people in this field, in this area that would be great to talk? And I think that applies across the board. That's not just science. Your sources are the experts. They're the ones who know the topic the best, and you know. And if you're interviewing them, then they are smart and interesting enough to know who else in their field is doing what they're doing. And, you know, I think never be afraid to ask a question.
Never.
If you're afraid to ask a question, you're in the wrong business.
So you have to dissect and explain pretty complicated and complex things.
Yeah.
What was your toughest story assignment?
That's a good question. Okay, you know, it's okay. Well, I don't know how interesting this is going to be, but I to explain it to you guys. Okay,
the wheels are turning.
So I did an infographic once for Wired about chemistry. And it was like a recent discovery. Oh God, this was so many years ago. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to explain it right. Basically what they had found was that they were looking into the structure of different chemicals, and one of the things that they had, this big discovery that they had made is that because of the way that synthetic chemicals are created, and because scientists tend to go to a chemical that's already created and use that to make another one, that the basic structure of most chemicals are the same. And so that was a really interesting discovery, because basically it meant that manipulating structures of chemicals and not using the same one would mean that we'd be able to discover all these chemicals that we hadn't been able to discover before, because we were all sort of going down this same path to find new ones, and we weren't branching out to different things. So the infographic was pictures of drawings of molecules. So I think, you know, and it was like, look, this one structure, you know, here's how many of synthetic chemicals we have now that are this structure, and here's how many synthetic chemicals we have now that are this structure. And it's not the most interesting topic. And drawings of molecules, it's not that visually interesting.
This was for the magazine or for online?
This was for the magazine. It was a 2-page spread in the magazine, and props to Wired for like being willing to take on something like this, because
and giving real estate to it.
And giving 2 pages of it in a magazine like Wired is a huge deal. They don't just give away that much space that easily. But it was a fascinating topic. So, you know, and I was working in the office at that point. So that story, and in the end, it ended up being really, really interesting. But it was the kind of thing where it was me working closely with my editor, working closely with the art and design people and the fact checkers to try to figure out, first of all, how do we explain this really complicated thing? And a topic that people actually tend to shy away from. You won't see in science writing a lot of writing about chemistry, because it tends to be very complicated. And you might even think something like physics is harder to understand, but physics tends to be a little bit more theoretical. And so in physics, you can just talk about ideas. You don't necessarily have to be too concrete about it. But chemistry is so specific that people try not to write about it too much because it's really, really hard to explain. So that was definitely one of my hardest stories, was trying to like visualize these chemical structures in a way that was interesting. And I think it was successful. I hope it was successful.
Now, did you pitch that story, or was that story given to you?
No, I pitched that story. I read a paper about about this chemical discovery, and I pitched it. And
So you just read a research paper?
yeah, I mean, that'll happen a lot. I think a lot of science stories are about new discoveries and new papers. So if you're interested in science writing, a really good thing to do is to follow PLOS, which is the Public Library of Science, and get a lot of journals, read Science Magazine, read Nature Magazine, and keep up to date about the newest and latest research and discoveries in science. Of course, there's always a pitfall there, which is that not every study is good, not every study is legitimate, so you have to also teach yourself how to understand what makes a good study and what makes a legitimate study. Otherwise, you fall into a trap that a lot of science journalists fall into, which is, we have a new invisibility cloak, which just makes a great headline, and I'm sure you've read it a lot of times, but the reality is we do not have an invisibility cloak.
So that goes through vetting and digging deeper than just
Exactly.
taking a research paper and saying, hey, I have this grand idea.
Exactly.
I'm going to ask one more question before I open it up to you guys, and my question is about freelancing.
Okay.
So in just a general sense, what are the pros and cons of freelancing versus saying, have you ever been on staff?
I'm not really. I was sort of on staff as a fact checker.
Okay. So what are some pros and cons that you see in freelancing since you've made a career out of it?
Okay. So, I think freelancing, I used to say anybody could freelance, and I take that back. I don't think that's true anymore at all.
What was your thinking before? And what
Well, I used to just think, if you have a good stable of clients and you have regular work, then you can be a freelancer. But the reality is that it's a hustle. It's an absolute hustle. There's no question about that. You have to be really good at time management. You have to be good at breaking yourself out of procrastination, which is like the #1 thing that writers do. And I was so guilty of it. That's one thing I'm still working on. I'm not great at not procrastinating.
Work in progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to be good at like seeing down the line and looking forward into your future. You have to be able to create a pipeline for yourself, which means that you need to keep an eye on that pipeline and see where it is at all times. So by that I mean like you need to have in process at all times one long feature story that's going to make you a ton of money. But then you also need to have lots of little short stories that won't make you quite as much money but that are going to pay right away. Right? Because a lot of publications pay differently. There's no one set way that you're going to get paid. So you're going to get paid by web. You're probably going to get paid really quick. If you're writing a web story, you'll probably get paid right away, but you will get paid pittance. If you're writing for a magazine, you won't get paid right away. You either get paid on publication or months after that publication, and a feature story can take 6 months to a year to write. So you're looking at 1.5 years or 2 years before you get paid for a story. And
especially when it's scheduled to actually run.
And nowadays there's so much. Magazines are getting smaller and smaller. There's so much competition for space. There's so much competition for those pages that even if you do have a story that's set to run, it's going to get bumped, it's going to get bumped, it's going to get bumped. And so you have no guarantee. Even if you thought you were going to get paid 1.5 years, you might get paid 2 years, you might get paid 3 years.
Or the story may not even run.
Or the story might not even run at all.
It might not be timely
and then
anymore.
you get paid a kill fee, right, because they keep bumping it. So, as a freelancer, there's no job security at all. You never know if that story is going to run. You never know, maybe it's going to run at half the size that you thought it was going to run. Although usually if that happens, you still get paid the full rate for it because it's not your fault, unless it's your fault. And so that is really difficult. A lot of people cannot live with that kind of uncertainty. A lot of people want structure. They want guaranteed paycheck coming every month.
They want benefits.
They want health
401k.
benefits. I pay for my own insurance. I do not have a 401k. unfortunately. And so, but and I don't have job security. And at any minute, I might lose a gig. And that actually happened to me recently. You also never know, either you have no guarantee. You could pitch tons of things to somebody and they could say, oh, I like all those stories. But then once they, make their lineup for the next issue, none of those stories work out. And you were counting on those stories where you shouldn't have been. You should have been pitching to other people too, because you just never know what's going to happen with the story, so you want to have a lot going at once. And if you have to be able to be juggling, if you're not somebody who can juggle a lot, if you're not somebody who can handle the insecurity of that, then freelancing is not for you. And also, if you're not somebody who's able to wake up in the morning and put on pants and leave the house, then freelancing is not for you. On the flip side, I am my own boss. I have complete freedom. I can move to New York from San Francisco and not have to talk to anybody about it. I don't have to ask permission to go on vacation. If I
make your own schedule.
I make my own schedule. I can work from midnight to 5 a.m. if I want to, and it doesn't matter as long as I meet the deadline. It doesn't matter what I do with myself during the day. As long as I get my work done, then I can do that however I please. And if you work in an office, it's very different. You have meetings you have to go to, you have people that are counting on you that you have to see, and for me, I personally think that that's torture. And to me, that sounds like a horrible prison that I don't want to be in. But some people like that, but it's not for me. So, there are pros and cons to both. There are pros and cons to both, for sure. And freelancing is not easy. And anybody who tells you it's easy is lying, or they're terrible at it.
I'm going to now open the questions up to you guys. Alex.
My question is twofold. So,
Okay.
First, how do you add color to a story that has a subject matter that tends to be dry? And then second, just out of curiosity, have you ever used the Department of Rockers as a source?
I haven't, but now that I'm on the East Coast, I probably will.
Okay.
I'm gonna, most of living in San Francisco for 10 years, there's so much great science there, there's so many, NASA's there, and there are a lot of national labs there, Stanford's there, so a lot of my sources would just be West Coast based because I was around and it was easy for me to go to a Stanford lab. But now that I'm here, I absolutely am gonna be, getting to know the labs and the scientists in this area, so for sure. So, the best way to add color to a story is to find the people angle, the personal angle, and find the narrative. The thing that is always the most interesting is the person. It's always the most interesting. Even when you are writing about a discovery, even if the discovery is interesting, the person who made the discovery is probably really interesting too. So, and that's something that I learned at Wired. What's something they really focus on when they do a feature story, there is always a narrative. They always want to start with a person, and then they're going to tell that person's story, and through that person's story, you're going to learn about whatever technology they've made or whatever science they've discovered. But, if you can find an interesting and engaging person who has an interesting story to tell, that story is going to always have good color. And actually,
Evan Rose in your
right,
story.
that perfect drug story, that piece that you guys read, that story did not start with Evan. Evan came way later. That story started with hearing about the company that was doing the cancer drug, that was doing the mouse avatars, and from there I was talking to them like, this is a great story, but it's not that interesting. We're just telling a story about mouse avatars. It's not relatable. Who's gonna who really cares? Like, okay, you're making mouse avatars, like that's great if you care about science and if you're interested in science, but if you're just a human, it's like, all right, you're growing tumors on mice, okay. But then I found through the company, I said, introduce me to some people. Introduce me to some of your clients. Let me talk to some people about their experiences and what they went through. And Evan's story is so moving. It's so, he's so passionate, and he's gone, above and beyond trying to save himself. And his wife, gave up her job to dedicate her life to saving him. And they had a kid while that was happening. And you know, that story is so much more compelling, so much more interesting. I mean, that like grabs you, digs you right in. Like, he was gonna die, but he didn't. He didn't die? How didn't he die? Well, here are these mouse avatars that saved his life. You know, now all of a sudden the mouse avatars are interesting and you care about them. You're rooting for them. You know, like, those little mice saved his life, yay for the mice, you know? But you wouldn't care about the mice if you didn't care about Evan first. So I really think people's stories and narratives, telling a narrative story is always the best way into any topic, you know?
And with that story, we've been talking a lot about angles. So you said the story first seemed, you know, it's really not that interesting. However, the approach.
Well, it was interesting, but it could have been more interesting.
And the approach in it, though, by telling Evan's story, made it more compelling.
Right, exactly. And I think anytime, and this will happen to you, whether you're writing about science, whether you're writing about anything, anytime you come to an editor with an idea, they'll always say, well, find me the person, you know, that makes that idea more compelling. Always.
More questions? Nicole in the back?
What's your favorite like subcategory of science to write about?
Well, so one of the things that I do is every month for the Mythbusters website, tested.com, I profile field scientists. And I've been doing it for a couple years now, and it has become my absolute all-time favorite thing to do. And it's mainly because these people are so interesting. They have dedicated their lives to going out into the world and figuring out how the world works and what makes the world tick. And they're going to dangerous environments. They're putting their lives at risk. They are climbing mountains. They are going to the Arctic on, you know, ice-breaking ships. They are going to Antarctica and hanging off the sides of boats in, you know, ice-cold water with 25-foot-long poles trying to tag humpback whales. I mean, they are, you know, 6 months of the year on a ship, and these people are so passionate about what they do, and absolutely by far writing about field science has become, through meeting all these people, my favorite thing to write about. The people, right? The people.
Erin?
Hi, I actually have two questions, one of which is kind of related to what she said. The first is, what's the gender balance like in science writing, and if you have any perspective on what's it like versus just regular magazine writing, that would be interesting too.
Sure.
And also, what has been the most fun you've had covering a story, or the most interesting story you've written?
Okay, let's see. So you will be surprised to hear that science writing is mostly women. Yay! I don't know how that happened, but some of the great science writers right now are all women. And that is not common for journalism at all. Most areas of journalism are, except probably fashion and women's magazines. And I don't know about entertainment. Is there? Probably, yeah. I mean, journalism is mostly men. It's still a boys' club. Totally, it's still a boys' club. Tech publications, men. You know, when I was at Wired, Wired actually does have a lot of women in the office, but not a lot of them are editors. Although that's changing. But most tech publications are men. Gaming is a lot of men in gaming. I mean, especially, you know, and there's a lot of backlash against that right now, actually, especially. But gaming is very man-centric. So science journalism just happens to be this really great oasis of women writers. I cannot tell you why. I have no idea, but it's fantastic. And and another thing I'll say about the science journalism community is that it's a very small community within journalism. Everybody tends to know each other, and unlike other areas of journalism, science writers are so supportive of each other. It's one of the most supportive journalism communities I have ever seen and ever been in. Everybody is so excited for each other, everybody promotes each other's work, everybody tends to know each other, and it's just like, and I think, I don't really know why, but I think part of it just comes from the fact that we're all really super curious about the world and how it works. And we're really like super nerdy, right? Like it's not just, you know, tech geeks, it's not, right, like gaming geeks. This is science nerdery, which is like a whole other level of geek, right? So I think, you know, not necessarily used to knowing other people who are excited by the same topics that we're excited by, like how many people get excited about physics. So to be able to be in a community of people who are like, no way, tell me about that new particle. You know, right? That everybody tends to just be really supportive of each other and excited about talking about things and sharing each other's work. So, and there are men in the science journalism community, and those men are also excellent and supportive and open-minded and great. And I really love being a science journalist. What was the other question? The most fun?
Yeah, what most fun you've had at a story?
That's really hard because I really love every story. And I always get really excited about a new story, and I feel like every story I'm writing is the most interesting one I've ever done. But actually, I did get to do something really cool that wasn't for a story. That was just cool because I knew a guy. So when you're a science journalist, you just get to know really cool scientists and really cool people. So a couple of years ago, Stanford shut down their linear accelerator. Do you guys need to know what a linear accelerator is? Okay, so basically what they're doing, it's a little bit difficult to explain, but basically what they're doing is they're taking little tiny, teeny tiny particles, which are the smallest things that there are in the universe, and they are shooting them at extremely high speeds into each other and getting them to explode into pieces and then seeing what's there. And it's just sort of, that's a really simplified basic explanation. It's a lot more complicated than that. But basically the idea is to try and figure out what makes up the universe and how did the universe come to be and what are all the particles that make us what we are. And you can't see these particles, so you have to figure out a way to sort of illuminate them. And the way that they do it is they shoot them at each other at really super high speeds. And these machines you can't go into them because they're very dangerous and they're also like worth billions of dollars, and so nobody ever gets to go inside. But it was the 50th anniversary of the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and they had shut it down for maintenance. So they invited a group of people, science writers and scientists and whatever, to come inside the linear accelerator and wander around and see the inside of it. And it was one of the coolest things I've ever done and seen in my life, and I will never ever forget it, because now the linear accelerator is back on, and it'll probably be another 50 years before anybody gets to go back, you know, aside from the scientists working on it, before, like, you know, some random
look.
Yeah, right. And I did, even though I didn't write a story about it, I did live tweet the entire thing. I was taking pictures the whole time. I was explaining, you know, on Twitter how the linear accelerator worked and what each of these little parts and pieces were, and people were like totally captivated, and it was really fun, and it was a great way to build my brand.
Right. Sharing that experience.
Inside the linear accelerator, and, you know, explaining it as I was going, and that was super fun.
By any chance, was that when you dressed in full garb?
No, that was different. Did you show
Oh
the
yes,
picture?
that circulated around the entire
So that
department.
picture was for a story that I did for Wired, which was a photo essay inside Applied Materials, and they're the people who make the chips that go into your cell phone that makes your cell phone work. And they had figured out a way to build a transistor on top of that chip. And I mean, you're talking about like minuscule, like you could take your chip out and you won't be able to see the transistor. It's like the size of an atom. When they had figured out how to move individual atoms into place to make these transistors work, and they were just like a few atoms high, which is like crazy. It's totally crazy if you think about like moving a single atom. So it's crazy. So I did a photo essay about their new machine that they had built that moves individual atoms around to build these teeny tiny little transistors that make your cell phone work. But it's a clean room. It's like Intel, you know, in the rabbit suits, when you know, if you see the Intel commercials with all the scientists in their bunny suits, they're like, you know, because when you're working with single individual atoms, if you get even a molecule, I mean, a molecule is like this compared to an atom, which is like this. So if you get one molecule in the wrong place, it throws the whole system off. So when you go into that clean room, you have to put on this whole suit, and you go through, they blow air on you, and you go through and you walk on these like sticky things to get everything off your feet, and then, you can't breathe really in there, like you have to have this thing on because any tiny little thing out of place will mess up their whole thing. So that was when I got to wear the bunny suit, was when we went down to do the photo shoot of all of their machinery and stuff in their clean room to show the process of making this atom-sized transistor.
Bunny suit, not hazmat suit.
No, hazmat is a totally different thing. Hazmat is about not letting things get in.
Got
A
it.
bunny suit is about not letting stuff get out.
More questions? Michelle?
Would you say if we're interested in freelancing that it's more effective to try to pick a subject that we're interested in and stick with that in our writing?
Yes, and I think that is not just freelancing. That's a case across the board. You're not gonna make it in the business if you are writing about fashion and science and technology. Well, technology and science kind of tend to go together, and you can mix those. But you want to have a specialty. You have to have a specialty because you have to be able to prove to the editor that you know what you're talking about. Nobody's going to assign you a story on something that you are not knowledgeable in. And if your stories are all over the place, then they have no way to know what you actually really know about. And then the other thing is, it makes it a lot easier to move forward if you have a niche. If you, especially in entertainment writing, is one of the hardest, I think, of all the types of journalism to get into. I think entertainment writing is one of the hardest because everybody wants to write about entertainment because it's really fun and cool and interesting. And because there are so many people writing about it, and because a lot of the stories are kind of the same, right? It's a lot of the same stories. Angelina Jolie cut her hair. Everybody's writing that story. Every publication has that same story. So if you have a niche where whatever that niche may be, where you're the go-to person for Angelina Jolie's hair, then you're guaranteed to be the one that gets to write that story. But if you write about everything and you're not the go-to for that, then nobody's going to go to you. Right? So it's really, really important to have a niche. And, science is a really broad niche to have. And, within science, I probably write about biology and field science a little bit more than I write about other stuff. I'm just working on a story right now for Newsweek, which I probably can't tell you what it's about, but it has to do with the earth and environment and field science. And my editor came to me right away and he said, this is just the right story for you. You could totally do this one about, field science and earth science. And I know about that topic. I know a lot of those scientists. So that got me that story. I had that special niche, and he knew who's a person who writes about field science. Erin can do that one. So that's really, really helpful. It's really important to have a niche.
More questions? Jen?
I guess, what's your view on the whole Ebola crisis going on? And, are you planning on writing a story about that?
I'm not going to write about Ebola.
Yeah.
Everybody's writing about Ebola.
Yeah.
Nobody needs my opinion on it. I've got other stuff to write about, and they have, and a lot of these organizations have their go-to health people that are going to write about Ebola. My opinion about Ebola, I think that, the media tends to be really fear-mongery. I think the media really likes to get people worked up about stuff, and it's not just their fault, it's the people's fault too. People like to get really worked up about things. If people didn't click on the story, then they wouldn't write the story. So it's everybody's fault, really. But I think that, one of the reasons why Ebola is such a problem in Africa is because it is spreading in very poor countries where they don't have the infrastructure or the money to support the doctors. They have doctors, the doctors are coming in from outside to help, and locally, it's hard for them to contain it. They just don't have the money. So, are we going to have a horrible Ebola outbreak in the U.S.? No, of course not. We're rich. We have tons of money. We have the money to set up quarantines for poor nurses in New Jersey who don't have Ebola. We're not gonna have an Ebola outbreak here. We can handle it. We have the CDC. We have an organization whose job it is to not have outbreaks. These poor countries in Africa do not have the money to have these organizations. So my opinion about Ebola is that what we really need to be doing, and what the journalists who are writing about Ebola, I think, are, there was a Slate did a story about it, which I thought was good, but I think there needs to be more writing about it, which is that Ebola is a natural disaster, just like a hurricane, just like, you know, an earthquake, just like a tsunami. We are really, really good in this country about giving money to natural disasters, but we are not giving money to Ebola. For some reason, people are just not donating to Ebola. And so if we really want to contain this and we really want to help Africa and they really, really need it, what they need more than anything is money. And so, you know, maybe that's a story that somebody, you know, Slate did it, but maybe more people need to be writing about the fact that Ebola is a natural disaster. Take your money out of your pockets, give money to the Red Cross, just like you did for Haiti, just like you did, you know, for the tsunami. Give some money and we'll nip it in the bud, you know. If they had money, they would shut it down.
Victoria, did you have a question?
Yes. I wanted to go back to freelancing. You talked about pipelining and having a good time management, but I was wondering, do you feel today that you've reached a point where there's a good balance between the time that you invest into a piece and the return that you get into a piece?
My ROI.
What I mean as an example is, for example, a lot of times I've noticed that in freelance writing, like they'll say, oh, we'll pay you $10 for an article, and maybe if somebody pulls stories out of their ears in a minute, they'll make pretty good money. But if it takes me like 2 weeks to write a story, $10 is not so good.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, like, how.
Absolutely. So one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got when I was just going out and freelancing was from Rebecca Smith-Hurd, who was the former assistant managing editor at Wired. She's a wonderful, amazing person, and I'm so grateful to her for this advice, which is that you have to remember that every single word that you write is worth money, and you have to put some value on that. And don't ever write anything for free. Just don't, because then you determine that your value is nothing. So, you know, I just have I have a little thing in my head, and I look at every story that I write, and I say, well, this is how much time it's going to take me. And you only learn this from experience, right? From every story you do, and you only know this by making a few mistakes and doing a few things wrong, working too hard on a story that you shouldn't have worked so hard on. But I can look at a story and I can say, well, this is the minimum amount of time it's going to take me. If I really half-ass it and I write it really fast, this is the minimum amount of time I'm going to take me. And if the amount of money that they're paying me is not even worth the minimum, then it's not worth it, and then I don't do it. Now, when you're getting started in freelancing, that's not always possible. Sometimes you have to do work that doesn't pay you enough just so that you can get that byline. So that's another thing that you have to weigh. If you're gonna get a byline in a publication that's gonna get you more work, then writing that story is worth a lot more than just money, right? But you always need to be paid something. And the more that you agree to do work for nothing, then the more that the rest of us are gonna suffer. And you're gonna hurt yourself in the long run, because these editors all know that they can get work for nothing, so why would they pay more? You know, so it's like, so do I think I have a good balance? No, I mean, I think I still sometimes will every now and again spend a lot more time on a story than I should, just because I'm really interested in the story, or I find it really exciting, or I really like the person that I'm working for. I absolutely have written a story for not a lot of money, for way less money than I should have, because I really like the editor and I wanted to do them a favor. But that doesn't, but I don't do that every time. So it's a balance, and you figure it out, and the only way that you can figure out that balance is just by doing it. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's really interesting that you say that people who actually do it for free, which I think is a lot of people and too many of them, that they're actually hurting all of us.
I think you do. You hurt everybody. It's like a trickle down, right? It's like the less they can pay, you have to remember that the people that, and it's not the editor's fault. It's not, you never blame an editor. It's not an editor's responsibility. It's the people, the money people, right? If they can pay you less, they will. They will pay you as little as they possibly can. And the only person that's going to say, you need to pay me more is you, right? And the way that you do that is by only accepting the work that pays you what you feel is, you know, the correct value. And by turning down the work that is unreasonable. I once had somebody get in touch with me, and I won't say who, but who got in touch with me and said, we need a monthly newsletter for our site, or a weekly newsletter for our site. It's gonna be like 500 to 1,000 words every week, and we can pay you $150 a month for it. No! Absolutely not. There is no way that I'm doing that. And actually, I'm insulted. Like, how dare you? How dare you think that's how much I'm worth? I'm worth way more than that. And I think, you know, you have to have the confidence to believe that you're worth more. You just have to have that confidence. And you are. You are worth more.
You totally show that confidence in your piece.
Oh my God.
Yes, I have to bring it up. And you think, oh,
Right, you know, it was funny because some of the comments I got back on that were that I was really arrogant and that I'm like really full of myself and that, you know, I shouldn't be so arrogant and that maybe if I wasn't so arrogant I would get paid more. But I'm not arrogant. I'm good at what I do and I'm worth more money. And that's not arrogance, that's just a fact. It's just a simple fact that, you know, I'm talented, I'm good at what I do. A lot of editors want me to work for them. That's the truth. And if that's the truth, then I should be paid more than nothing for something. So, you know, it's okay to be confident and it's okay to feel like you're worth something. And if you don't, then you're never going to make any money. It's not arrogance, it's just the fact.
in the back, Regina?
Yeah. I kind of had a question going back to like you talked about your brand and like maybe some tips having to do with your work, but also like social media and stuff like that.
So what do you mean? Be more specific.
Well, like you have to be good at writing so your brand becomes better, but also
Right.
promote it, you know?
Right. Well, so honestly, like, I think Twitter is really great for journalists. I think Twitter is maybe the best thing for journalists. I've gotten a lot of work through Twitter. Just because on Twitter, all the journalists, all the editors, all the reporters, everybody's on Twitter. And so if you go on Twitter and you follow all the people that you love, all the publications that you love, all the editors that you want to work for, and then you build, you know, and then you talk to them about whatever, about the topics that they like, the topics that they're interested in, the topics that, then they know you. They know your name, they know you through Twitter, and then they follow you, and then on Twitter you
You'll see your work.
you post your work, you present the ideas that you're interested in. I complain about stuff a lot. That probably I think that got me my popular science column, because when they were looking for a new columnist, they wanted somebody that was going to be a little bit more confrontational and have a little bit more of an attitude, and I certainly do that. You know, and you can definitely see that on Twitter. I'm always bitching about things. So, I mean, I'm all for Twitter. I know a lot of people, I know some people who don't like it and who don't feel like they should be building their brand, and they're still working. But I think, you know, I'll go to science conferences, I'll go to the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting, and people will come up to me and say, oh, I follow you on Twitter. So obviously, you know, and I've never met these people before in my life, but obviously my brand is out there. So I think, you know, social media is a really great way to build your brand and to get your name out there and to meet editors, to meet other writers. All the science journalists all follow each other on Twitter and all know each other that way. So, you know, I mean, that's a really great way to do it.
We probably have time for 2 more questions, so one from each side. Over here.
I just had a question. I was just curious what made you come back to the East Coast and how it's different from California,
It was totally, completely personal reasons.
Oh, okay.
It was not work related.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to live in New York again. I just wanted to live back on the East Coast. I'm from New Jersey, and California just isn't my speed. So I just wanted to come back.
So do you like it? So you like working in New York better than?
Well, I've only been here for a week, so I don't really know yet. I'm sure I'm gonna love it. California is great for science and tech. I mean, San Francisco is great for tech. You know, if you want to write about tech, you have to go to San Francisco. I mean, you know, you just have to go to San Francisco. go. I mean, you can do science from anywhere, but I mean, you know, like I said, you know, Stanford, Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore, NASA Ames, there's a lot of great science stuff on the West Coast. So, you know, I had a great time there. I got a lot of sources. Now I'm ready to explore the East Coast.
Megan.
You had mentioned before that you didn't really necessarily have a background in science. So how do you go about researching before you tackle a story?
Well, it totally depends on the story. Every story is different. So it's a little bit difficult to answer that question, but I will read, if I'm going to interview a professor or something, I'll go to their website, I'll read their papers, you know, I'll try to get my mind around what they're working on. I'll try to read other papers that are written about a particular topic, and I will just like basically just try to read as much as you can. And then, you know, you just gotta ask the scientist. I mean, you know, there are absolutely without question times when I have called a scientist and said, I have no idea what this is about. I do not understand it at all, so we have to start from the beginning. And they respect that honesty, and like I said, they're educators, so they're happy to explain it, you know, and there are absolutely times when I've said, I don't understand that, go back and say it again a different way. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say, let me get this straight. Let me explain this back to you to make sure that I'm getting it right. And if you have a dedication to factual accuracy, there's nobody who's going to be impatient with you. People love a reporter who thinks that factual accuracy is important, and they will spend time with you, helping to make sure that you understand it, because they want you to represent their work in a correct way. So, like I said, don't ever be afraid to ask a question.
We actually do have time for one more question. Ashley, we'll end with.
Early on in your career, did you ever find yourself like short, like, or half-assing one story because you were juggling so many others?
Absolutely. Especially as a freelancer, that totally happens. I mean, when you are working on so many stories at once, some of them just aren't going to get as much attention as others. And, you know, and you just have to know which ones need the time and which ones don't. I mean, sometimes you can write a story really quick because it just doesn't need as much attention. So, yeah, absolutely, I've done that. But I shouldn't say that. Is that bad? No, I never have had a story.
Well, everyone, let's give Erin a round of applause.